Good morning. This is Karen with newclevelandradio.net. And today we are talking about lessons learned. And my guest has been recommended to me by a very good friend, David Zimmer, Meet the Biz. And Quans- Consuelo Flores is with us today. And if you don't learn everything about her in this podcast, just Google her because you will be sitting there amazed and happy that there is an individual like her out there. So, Consuelo, tell me a little bit about your background. How did you get into the Hollywood industry?
Well, that was I kind of fell into it. It was not something that I sought out. I didn't train for it. I fell into it by volunteering. I volunteered because I was always very community oriented. So I volunteered at one place and that led to another. And then I was asked to volunteer for a conference that was happening and it was about Latinos in the industry. And so I volunteered and I was very good at it because I enjoyed talking to and meeting people of different backgrounds. And within the Latino community, it is a diversity of people. It's not just, we're not a monolithic group. We look like everybody else. There are Black Latinos, Asian Latinos, white Latinos, indigenous Latinos, and then there is all in between, like all of the mixtures, right?
Sure.
And so it was a recognition that I had early on that we are all different and we are all special and we all can contribute well to the betterment of humanity in our society. So I never I never had any kind of reservations about what people could or could not do because I wanted that for myself as well.
And sadly, and I remember this growing up in the 50s and 60s, um, we were all sort of defined by what community we lived in, um, how much money our parents made or didn't make. So if you lived in a somewhat wealthy community, but your parents made at the bottom of that level, sometimes you weren't accepted. And yet
Exactly.
here you were living in a community where community is about all coming together. And it took me a long time to understand that, um, I was just as good as the next one, but I have different talents. I have different interests. Um, and today I saw somebody wrote on Facebook, it's not about being Republican, Democrat, it's about being human. And that's what I see that you've been doing in the industry for a long time. It's the human side and acceptance. So I'm sort of glad that you didn't have a certain vision when got into all this. So tell me, and I think it's interesting when you identified Latino that there is no specific look. And why do we think that because we come from a certain background, even if it's only a partial, that we're supposed to look a certain way?
I think it's a person's way to have a shortcut for understanding. And quite frankly, the media enforces that. It's very easy for people in the higher positions to say, okay, well, we need a Latino, we need a person who's Black, we need an Asian, we need a Native American. And it's easier for them to sell it if it's already predisposed what people look like. Um, and so for that reason, it's a constant perpetuating cycle of stereotype, trying to break it, easy to define, easy to recognize, stereotype, and it just keeps going. And so, and that applies to everyone, in the disability community, there are so many different disabilities,
Right.
and yet the ones that we most often see are people in wheelchairs, because that's a visual, and it's a very quick, um, okay, he's disabled or she's disabled. And it's very quick. You don't have to explain, oh no, the disability is this, or even if a person has, and it's easier for an audience, I think, to see a disability where you can see still a whole body. Whereas if you're missing limbs, that becomes a sort of a gate or an obstacle that the story has to overcome in order for it to resonate with people. No one wants to lose limbs. So no one wants to not walk, but it's easier for a performer, I think, to be an able-bodied, playing disabled, for the audience to accept it. It's easier because, oh, but that's just acting. Though no one wants to really accept people with disabilities. I'm not saying that that's a generalization, but it's
Sure.
harder. That's another challenge that storylines don't necessarily want to tackle.
Well, and I can understand, there's some people that will be watching a movie, but they know, like you said, that actor, actress, after that scene is going to get up out of a wheelchair and maybe go run a marathon, and they look at it and say, well, that's okay. That was just temporary.
Exactly.
But the reality of it is, when we have a disability, that disability is not temporary, but it also doesn't necessarily mean that we aren't able to do what is being asked of us.
Yes, absolutely. And that is something that I have recognized from pretty much from day one, when I started interfacing with people with disabilities. I mean, granted, there are some disabilities that are more, the productivity is a lot less. However, there are some personality disabilities, is what I call them, that, the people are completely able-bodied, but there is something personality wise. Like, for example, I think racism is an ism that we need to tackle as well. And that disables in a different way, but it disables our progress going forward. It's very, very, I would rather, um, have a person who is good-hearted, and I can interface and have a wonderful relationship with, than a person who has this, darkness, a mean spirit to them that can be violent and can be very destructive.
Absolutely. Well, the first time I experienced a real disability in myself was about 12 years ago, when they found a tumor in my ear. They went to remove it. Doctor did not remove it properly.
Uh,
Um, and I lost my hearing in that ear. And as he said, just to be sure, he checked my other ear, even though the MRI showed it was clear, and disabled my hearing in that ear. And so
uh,
here I was in my 50s wearing hearing aids, but initially feeling very old about it. It was like, oh, only old people lose their hearing, which I knew was not true, but that's how I felt. And so I sort of hid it from my coworkers, covering my ears with my hair, um, you know, working desperately to, hear what they were saying with hearing aids. And there's certain tones that you just don't get. Hearing aids are just at their an aid, but they don't restore your hearing. And I finally got to a point one day when my upper management said to me, you know, don't you think you want to retire? And I said, but why? Well, you're having difficulty hearing us. And my comment was, not really. I only have a difficulty when you choose to whisper or talk behind my back. Um, and that's when I realized my hearing aids were a disability, which I didn't want to accept. So from that day on, I started wearing my hair behind my ears, telling people ahead of time, if I don't hear you properly and I ask you to repeat it, this is why. And I felt so much better about myself, stronger, and I was
Empowered.
empowered, and I was able to accept other people more willingly because I may not be able to see, like you said, if they're not in a wheelchair, I may not know what they're disabled from. And so it was getting to really dig deep and get to know people and help
Mhm.
me find my strengths and help them find theirs. So when you're working with this community, and we know it's a vast community, um, how do you approach it, especially in the Hollywood business when so many people, really want to be out there in front?
I approach it like I do any person that who I value. It's um people are different. Every person is it's their own unique individual. Like I said earlier about the Latino community, we're not a monolithic community. And that's the same for it applies to the same in no one is a gatekeeper. And I would rather learn about individuals than a large group of individuals, and then apply that knowledge to what I have learned, what I've learned to what the work is that I'm trying to achieve, what the goal is. So, for example, if a person is blind, they're going to have very different needs than a person who is in a wheelchair, or a person who doesn't have limbs, or a person who has hearing loss. Each of those uh, representations of disabilities are very different, just like an individual who identifies as female is going to have different needs than a person who identifies as male. So it's not that big of a stretch to understand that there are specific needs. Children have different needs than adults. Older people have different needs than babies. It just, you need to be very open to understanding and then facilitating, understanding needs and facilitating, um, addressing them.
Now, it's too bad that we aren't taking that out of the industry where you are and more of us doing that in our day to day life.
Well, storytelling is a representation of life. And so when the industry tells stories about individuals, it's the most common denominator in terms of educating the populations. Everyone can watch a television show, and that television show will tell a story about X person, and which is different than people who live in Seattle, Washington, or people who live, in the Midwest. It's that experience or that individual may not exist in the same way. So
Right.
those people who watch this story are going to learn about individuals. And when they see an individual later on, they're going to say, oh, that's like that story that I saw. So that person is not, a scary person. That person is not, should not be viewed as any less than myself.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
so that honors the communities that each of those stories represents.
So, how do individuals, with whatever their, and I don't like calling them disabilities because I think you have more,
Different abilities.
thank you, because that's exactly it. Um, because my hearing is not as acute as I would like it to be. Sometimes I have to do more reading or I have to listen harder. I have to find something to overcome that. So, how do individuals find you if they say, you know what, I want to be in the industry and I have the ability to sing despite the fact that I'm in a wheelchair? I have the ability to act, um, even though I may walk with a cane. All these different things that, like you pointed out, sometimes when we see these adaptives, we think they're less than. So how does that individual come to you strong enough to say, "Hey, this is what I want to do"?
Well, I would say the very first thing is identify your passion, whatever that is. And then, that's how I started. And that's how a lot of people do start in the industry or in whatever area of passion they really want to focus their energy on. And that is to volunteer at nonprofits or organizations that have that something related to your passion.
Okay.
So I know, for example, I'm also a visual artist. And I volunteered at a arts organization in my community. I took classes there. I interfaced with the executive director, and pretty soon I was being given, opportunities to do my own art. And now I'm an established artist in that area. The same thing applies, and that's my other life. I'm also a writer. So I would read and write, and then, hey, I want to do a reading here. And before I knew it, I was being invited to do readings. And now I was invited to write a chapter for an anthology that was published in October. And then subsequent to that, I was invited to be a co-editor for an anthology. So it's like you don't you if you have a passion, you don't have to limit yourself to waiting for people. You can actually be more active and go to and find research, find and participate as a volunteer for different organizations. There are so many conventions and conferences and big events that you can volunteer for, and it should not limit you if you are differently abled to volunteer, because you can do anything within the scope of your own abilities.
What a fantastic message because again, I know growing up it was a big thing in my family that we volunteered doing the things that we love to do. Um, and it was making those connections, and with those
Absolutely.
connections, building this circle around us so that we could achieve what we wanted to achieve, not necessarily what the rest of the world thought we should be achieving. I remember one day coming home and saying to my dad, I'm really successful. And I think I was in high school at the time. Um, I love to talk, I love to debate. So I joined the debate team. And we lost our first debate, but I came home and I said to him, you know, I found what I want to do in life. And even though we lost, I can tell you why we should have won. And he had me write it all down on paper. I took it back to um, our coach at the time, and he said, I'm glad you saw that. He said, you didn't have a strong enough team. That was, and I finally identified it, and I saw my problem in there too, and what I could do differently. And
Mhm.
from that point on, if something came along and I thought, hey, this is interesting, I did volunteer. Um, Whereas today, a lot of young people feel like they're giving their time away. And I don't care what your age is. You can volunteer as a young kid. You can volunteer, in your 80s and 90s, because if it's
Absolutely.
something you love, don't just sit and dream about it.
Absolutely. And so Yeah, you give stuff away. Sure, you give it away, but you don't understand what the return is on that for yourself, because you do establish relationships, you do get to meet people, you do use your skills in a way that is going to be satisfying to you, in a way that you may not have thought of prior to saying, oh, the concept is I'm going to give something away. But the reality is that you enrich your life in ways that are intangible. You don't, it's not here, here's a bottle of water. It's like there is a gift of understanding a different perspective and coming away from that with a much deeper sense of self and a much deeper sense of your community.
Absolutely. I remember my mother in her 80s. She had always, her occupation was not a seamstress, but she sewed for everybody her
Mhm.
whole life. And in her 80s, she told my dad that um, she was going to put up cards around the city, and she was going to, shorten pants, shorten dresses, whatever anybody wanted in the community. And she basically gave her time away. She charged them, but when everybody else was charging $15, $20 for the same thing, she was charging $2. But she had this great feeling doing it. Number one, it kept her busy. As she said, it helped her arthritis to keep moving. She was meeting people. And she said it wasn't so much about the money as it was about enriching her life through others. And when she passed away, some of those people who we had never even heard of just showed up at her funeral because of all the things that she had done for them.
Right.
And so, you're right. What you're giving away, you're getting so much more back in return.
So there's a, rich, being rich, you can be rich in so many different ways. And I can tell you that some of I've met, personally have met people who are monetarily rich, financially rich, and yet they are so poor in so many ways that I would not want to be rich like them.
Well,
So,
and that makes sense. When I met my husband almost 40 years ago, his name happens to be Rich, but he is far from wealthy. And I remember when we were getting married, my mother was teasing me, and she said, "The first time you marry for love, the second time you marry a rich man." And I said, "And I am, and his name is Rich, and my life has been enriched because the two of us have worked together as a team almost from day one.
yes,
Um, and I didn't have that with my first husband. So there are many ways to have all the wealth in your life, but it may not be in dollar signs.
exactly.
But you know what? If you can wake up every day and feel good about your venture in the day, that is exciting.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, do you have any projects coming up at the present time with anybody that we may want to look for on the small screen, big screen?
Well, there, I can't divulge too much, but in fact, on Wednesday, my husband and I have a project that is going to be pitched to different studios that we've been working on. And that's a personal passion project as well. Um, so that we hope to have a deal in place before the end of the year and maybe go into production at the start of next year. And it will be a union show. And so we're excited about that. It would be limited series on a on a pay platform like Netflix or Hulu
Sure.
or something like that. But yeah, that's a project that we're working on. I also have the anthology that's coming up. That will be published by Finishing Line Press. We start pre-sales online October 25th, going through December 31st. And that is And I'm very proud to say we have a huge diversity of writers, including people from the disability community or disabled community or differently abled community. And so very excited about that. And that will be going to pre-sales October, end of pre-sales December, and then it will be released as in book form, published in February. So we're very excited about that. And that is an anthology on COVID. Writers who wrote about their experiences during the COVID pandemic. So yeah, there are projects. I also have a project with the County of Los Angeles that I'm working on currently, and that is for racial equity. And that this is through visual arts. So that project will end in December with a whole bunch of activations throughout the County of Los Angeles with different neighborhoods or communities represented. So
you've got a lot on your plate, and
I do.
that sounds exciting. Yeah.
And oh, and then one last one is I'm curating a show, a Day of the Dead show for a smaller but very established gallery here in Highland Park.
So if people wanted to follow you or to contact you, is there any way they can find you?
So I'm on Facebook. And it's Consuelo G. Flores, and I'm on Instagram and I'm on Twitter. I will admit that I don't always go on Instagram or Twitter as often, but I do go on Facebook more often.
Well, we'll make sure that we put that in the show notes in case.
And I'm also on LinkedIn.
Okay. And that was the first place that I found you, was on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
So we want our listeners to know how you can follow Consuelo if you'd like. We want to wish you the best of luck pitching this
Thank you.
project. It warms me to know that there are people out there that are using their talents, and they may not be the mainstream individual that we see walking down the street, and we all need to have a chance.
That's the perfect thing to say, because I worked in Hollywood, but I am not Hollywood. My role in that industry was truly working in it's either administratively, outreaching to community, making sure everybody is empowered and having a successful life moving forward.
Well, again, I want to thank you for joining us. And again, a big shout out to David, Meet the Biz Zimmerman, because he has shared so many of his relationships with us. And we just want to get the word out that no one has to do this alone.
Exactly.
We have to be present. We have to be looking around us and not assume that we don't have a chance. Assume you have a chance, and somebody will be there waiting for you to take you.
Absolutely. Why not you?
That's right. Absolutely. Thank you very much. And we'll be in touch again soon.
Thank you. Nice
Bye-bye
to meet
now.
you. Bye-bye.
Same here.